silent night. The snow fell softly that Christmas Eve, blanketing the world in an eerie, muffled quiet. I should have been at home, surrounded by laughter, warmth, and the faint smell of pine. Instead, I found myself stranded in the middle of nowhere, my car dead on the side of a winding road surrounded by trees that seemed taller than they should have been. The holiday had always been bittersweet for me since Mom passed away a few years back. This year, I had decided to skip the family dinner and take a drive to clear my head. It was supposed to be a short trip, just me, my thoughts, and a playlist of melancholy Christmas songs. The first sign of trouble came when the radio started to crackle. At first, I thought it was just static, but then I heard faint whispers beneath the interference. They were too soft to make out, but they sent a chill down my spine. A moment later, the car began to shudder. The engine sputtered once, twice, and then died completely. The headlights flickered and went out, plunging me into darkness. I tried the ignition, but it was no use. My phone was no better, no signal. Typical. I cursed under my breath and stepped out into the cold. The wind bit at my face as I looked around, hoping to see a house or some sign of civilization. There was nothing but trees and the narrow road stretching into the darkness. Then I saw it. A light. It was faint, a soft golden glow coming from deep within the woods. Part of me wanted to stay by the car, but the bitter cold made the decision for me. I grabbed my flashlight and started walking toward the light, the snow crunching under my boots, the only sound in the otherwise silent night. The glow led me to a small, weathered cabin nestled among the trees. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, and warm light spilled from the windows. Relief washed over me. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. I knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. "Hello," I called out, peering through the frosted glass. The inside looked cozy. There was a fire crackling in the hearth, a Christmas tree adorned with ornaments, and a table set with food. It was like something out of a holiday card, yet it felt off. The house was too quiet, too still. The door creaked open under my hand, and I stepped inside. "Hello?" My car broke down. "Is anyone here?" No response. I hesitated, but the warmth was too inviting. I closed the door behind me, shrugging off my coat. The fire crackled merrily, casting flickering shadows on the walls. A plate of cookies sat on the table next to a glass of milk, untouched. "Thank you for letting me in," I said aloud, as if whoever lived there could hear me. "I'll just warm up for a minute." I sank into a chair by the fire, the heat soaking into my frozen limbs. For the first time that night, I felt a sense of calm. But that calm didn't last long. I don't know how much time passed before I noticed the sound. It was faint at first, like the jingling of bells. I thought it was coming from outside, but when I opened the door, the woods were silent. The sound was coming from inside the cabin. I turned back, my eyes scanning the room. Everything was as it had been, the tree, the fire, the table. But now there was something else. A stocking hung by the fireplace that I hadn't noticed before. It was red, stitched with white letters that spelled out my name. My stomach dropped. I hadn't told anyone I was here. I hadn't told anyone my name. I approached the stocking cautiously. It was empty, but as I stared at it, I felt a presence behind me. My heart pounded as I turned, expecting to see someone standing there. But there was nothing, just the cabin, silent and warm. The bells jingled again, louder this time. And then, I heard footsteps, soft, deliberate, coming from the hallway that led to the back of the cabin. "Hello!" My voice cracked. "Is someone there?" The footsteps stopped. I moved toward the hallway, flashlight in hand, the beam cutting through the darkness. The air was colder here, each breath forming a visible cloud. The hallway ended at a door, slightly ajar. I pushed it open. Inside was a bedroom, simple but cozy. There was a bed, a dresser, and a small window that looked out into the woods. But what caught my attention was the figure standing in the corner. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. He was tall and thin, dressed in a red suit trimmed with white fur. His back was to me, but his head turned slowly, unnaturally, until I could see his face. It wasn't a face. Not really. Where his features should have been, there was only darkness, an emptiness that seemed to suck the light from the room. "Get out," the thing said, its voice a low, guttural growl. I stumbled back, slamming the door and bolting down the hallway. The cabin seemed different now, the walls closing in, the warmth of the fire replaced by a bitter chill. I grabbed my coat and ran for the door, but it wouldn't budge. The bells rang again, louder and more insistent, coming from everywhere at once. The room filled with whispers, low and indecipherable, like 1,000 voices speaking at once. The shadows danced on the walls, growing longer, darker, until they seemed to take shape. Hands reached out, clawing at the air. I screamed, kicking at the door until it finally gave way. The cold night air hit me like a slap, but I didn't stop. I ran, stumbling through the snow, the cabin's light growing smaller and smaller behind me. I don't know how I made it back to the road. My car was still there, as lifeless as I'd left it, but I didn't care. I climbed inside, locking the doors and curling up in the back seat. I must have passed out because when I woke, the sun was rising. The cabin was gone. The trees where it had stood were untouched, as if nothing had ever been there. But in my lap was the stocking, my name stitched in white letters, and inside it, a single bell. It jingled softly when I touched it, and for a moment, I thought I heard laughter, deep, cold, and cruel, echoing through the empty woods. That was the last Christmas Eve I ever spent alone. Christmas Eve to forget. The snowstorm had come out of nowhere, turning what should have been a simple drive home into a white-knuckled ordeal. The icy road stretched endlessly in both directions, flanked by skeletal trees dusted in snow. My phone had no signal, of course. It seemed almost cliché, like the beginning of a bad movie. But this was real, and it was happening to me. I shouldn't have taken the back roads, but I'd wanted to avoid traffic and get home to my parents' place in time for Christmas Eve dinner. I hadn't seen them in years, not since the falling out after Mom's diagnosis. Tonight was supposed to be a fresh start. Now, my little hatchback sat useless at the side of the road, the engine refusing to turn over. I cursed under my breath, pulling my coat tighter around me as the wind howled. The snow was falling faster, thicker, and the temperature was dropping by the minute. Staying in the car wasn't an option, not when I could already see my breath fogging up the windows. I grabbed my flashlight and set off, hoping to find help or at least shelter. The beam cut through the swirling snow, illuminating the forest on either side of the road. My boots crunched against the icy ground, the sound swallowed almost immediately by the storm. After what felt like an eternity, I saw a faint light ahead. Relief flooded through me as I quickened my pace. The light grew brighter, revealing a large, old-fashioned house nestled among the trees. It was the kind of place you'd see on a Christmas card, with warm yellow light spilling from its windows and a wreath on the front door. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, and I could just make out the faint glow of Christmas lights strung along the porch. I knocked on the door, half expecting it to swing open on its own, but it didn't. A moment later, it creaked open, and a woman in her 60s peered out. She had a kind face, framed by gray curls, and wore a festive red sweater. "Oh, you poor thing," she exclaimed, pulling the door wider. Come in, you must be frozen." "Thank you," I said, stepping into the warmth. The house smelled like pine and baking cookies, a stark contrast to the icy wilderness outside. The living room was cozy, with a roaring fire in the hearth and stockings hung neatly above it. A large Christmas tree stood in the corner, decorated with vintage ornaments that glimmered in the firelight. "Are you lost?" she asked, closing the door behind me. "My car broke down a few miles back," I explained. "No signal on my phone, and the storm." "Say no more," she interrupted, smiling warmly. "You're welcome to stay here until it passes. My name's Margaret, by the way. Let me get you some tea." I thanked her, sitting down on the couch by the fire. For the first time all evening, I felt safe. I pulled off my boots and warmed my hands by the flames, watching as they danced and flickered. Margaret returned with a steaming mug, and I accepted it gratefully. Thank you. I really appreciate this. Of course, dear, she said, sitting in the armchair across from me. It's nice to have company. My husband passed a few years ago, and the holidays can be lonely. I nodded, sipping the tea. It was sweet and spiced, the kind of drink that makes you feel instantly at ease. I'm sorry to hear that. Her smile faltered for just a moment before she changed the subject. Are you headed home for Christmas? Yeah, I said, to see my parents. It's been a while. She nodded thoughtfully. Family is important, especially this time of year. We talked for a while, and I found myself relaxing in her company. She was warm, kind, and everything about the house felt like a sanctuary. But as the night wore on, small things began to nag at me. The first was the clock. A large grandfather clock stood in the corner of the room, its hands frozen at midnight. I pointed it out and Margaret laughed softly. Oh, that old thing hasn't worked in years. I just keep it for the memories. The second was the tree. At first, I hadn't noticed, but the ornaments seemed strange. They weren't the typical glass balls or candy canes. Each one was unique, intricately carved figures of people. Their faces were so detailed it was almost unsettling. Did you make these yourself? I asked, pointing to the tree. Margaret's expression darkened, just for a moment. No, they've been in my family for generations. Each one tells a story. The room felt colder somehow, despite the roaring fire. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was just tired. But then I heard it. A faint noise, coming from somewhere upstairs. It was soft, like the creak of a floorboard or the shuffle of feet. Is someone else here? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Margaret's smile didn't reach her eyes. No, dear, it's just us. The noise came again, louder this time, and I couldn't ignore it. I think I heard something. It's just the house settling, she said quickly, too quickly. Old houses make noise. I wasn't convinced. My heart pounded as I stood, my flashlight in hand. Do you mind if I look? Her smile vanished. I'd rather you didn't. The way she said it sent a chill down my spine. I nodded, sitting back down, but my mind was racing. I needed to leave. The storm be damned. Something about this house wasn't right. As soon as Margaret excused herself to check on something in the kitchen, I made my move. I slipped down the hallway, my flashlight illuminating the creaky wooden stairs. The noise grew louder as I climbed, a faint shuffling, like someone dragging something heavy across the floor. At the top of the stairs was a single door. It was slightly ajar, and the sound was coming from inside. I pushed it open, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. What I saw made my blood run cold. The room was filled with ornaments like the ones on the tree, hundreds of them, hanging from strings or resting on shelves. Each one was a perfect, horrifyingly detailed figure of a person. And in the center of the room was Margaret, holding a knife. She didn't look at me at first, too focused on the figure she was carving from a block of wood. But when she did, her eyes were black, empty voids. You weren't supposed to come up here, she said, her voice low and guttural. I stumbled back, my flashlight shaking. What are you doing? Her smile stretched too wide, unnatural. Preserving memories. I didn't wait to hear more. I turned and ran, the sound of her laughter echoing behind me. The house seemed to twist and shift around me, the hallways stretching endlessly. The lights flickered, and the ornaments on the tree seemed to watch me as I passed. When I reached the front door, it wouldn't budge. No matter how hard I pulled, it stayed firmly shut. Margaret's voice echoed through the house. You can't leave, dear. You're part of the collection now. Panic surged through me as I grabbed a fire poker and smashed the nearest window. The icy wind howled in, and I climbed through, cutting my hands on the broken glass. I didn't care. I ran, not stopping until I was deep into the woods. When I finally turned back, the house was gone. Only the faint outline of its roof remained in the falling snow. I never found my car. Somehow, I made it to the main road, where a truck driver picked me up and took me to the nearest town. When I told the locals about the house, their faces paled. There hasn't been a house out there in 50 years, one man said. Burned down with the family inside. It's just woods now. The last Noel. Christmas Eve. The snow fell in heavy, silent drifts outside the window, burying the landscape in a blanket of white. My little cabin in the woods, miles away from the nearest neighbor, was the perfect retreat, or so I thought. After a year of endless stress, I decided to skip the family festivities and spend Christmas alone. It wasn't out of malice or some twisted holiday grudge. I just needed the peace and quiet. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long shadows on the pine panel walls. I sipped mulled wine, sinking deeper into my armchair as the old record player hummed Bing Crosby's White Christmas. Outside, the wind howled, shaking the old wooden frames of the windows, but I didn't care. I felt untouchable, wrapped in warmth and solitude. That was when I heard the first knock. It was faint, almost imperceptible over the storm, but unmistakably real. 3 deliberate taps, not the haphazard rattling of the wind. I froze, my heart beating faster. Nobody should have been out there. The cabin was secluded, surrounded by dense forest, with the closest road buried under a foot of snow. Knock, knock, knock. I set down my glass and stood, creeping toward the door. Hello, I called, my voice quivering despite my best efforts to sound firm. No answer. I peered through the peephole. The world outside was a swirling blur of snow and darkness. But there was no one there, just the empty porch, the sagging roof strung with Christmas lights that flickered faintly in the storm. Shaking my head, I laughed nervously. Get a grip, I thought. It's probably just the wind. Returning to my chair, I tried to brush it off, but my nerves were alight. I couldn't focus on the music or the fire. My gaze kept darting to the window, scanning for movement beyond the swirling snow. Then came the second knock. Louder this time, insistent. My pulse quickened. I grabbed the fireplace poker, a flimsy weapon but better than nothing, and moved toward the door again. Who's there? I shouted, louder this time. Nothing. I opened the door just a crack, the icy wind biting at my skin. Snow swirled into the room, dusting the floor, but the porch was empty. There weren't even footprints in the snow. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the weather. I slammed the door shut, bolting it this time. My mind raced. Maybe it was some kind of animal or my imagination playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew better. The knocking didn't stop. It came again, then again, in irregular bursts that seemed to mock my growing fear. Each time I checked, the porch was empty. Each time I closed the door, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the knocking stopped. I stood in the center of the room, fireplace poker clutched in my trembling hands, listening to the silence. The fire had burned low, casting weak, flickering light across the room. The record player had gone silent, leaving only the sound of the wind outside. Then I heard it, a faint scraping noise coming from the roof. My stomach dropped. Something or someone was up there. Get out of here, I shouted, my voice cracking. I'm armed, and I've called the police. It was a lie, of course. My phone had no signal out here, and even if it did, it would take hours for anyone to reach me in this storm. The scraping stopped, replaced by a heavy thud, as if something had jumped down to the ground outside. My breath caught. Slowly, I backed away from the door, my eyes darting between the windows. Shadows danced across the frosted glass, but I couldn't tell if it was the storm or something more. And then the singing started. It was faint at first, barely audible over the wind. A child's voice, high and sweet, singing Silent Night. Holy Night. The sound sent a shiver down my spine. It was coming from the forest, somewhere beyond the tree line. All is calm, all is bright. The voice grew louder, closer, though I could see nothing through the swirling snow. Sleep in heavenly peace. I covered my ears, stumbling backward. The song was wrong, distorted, the melody warping into something sinister. The windows rattled violently, as if something was trying to force its way inside. The lights on the Christmas tree flickered and died, plunging the room into near darkness. And then came the voice, low and guttural, whispering from the shadows. You let me in. The room spun. My knees buckled, and I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath. The voice was everywhere, surrounding me, suffocating me. You invited me in, remember? Left the door open, just a crack. Enough for me to slip inside. No, I whispered, shaking my head. No, you're not real. Oh, but I am. The voice crooned, and the fire flared suddenly, casting the room in blood-red light. The figure that emerged from the shadows was tall and thin, its body twisted and unnatural. Its face was pale and gaunt, with hollow black eyes that seemed to pierce through me. It smiled, revealing rows of jagged teeth. "Merry Christmas," it hissed. I scrambled backward, my back hitting the wall. "Stay away," I screamed, swinging the poker wildly. The creature laughed, a low, bone-chilling sound that echoed through the room. "You wanted to be alone, didn't you? No family, no friends. Just you and your little cabin in the woods. And now you are. Forever." It lunged toward me, its bony hands outstretched, and I swung the poker with all my strength. The metal connected with its head, and it let out an ear-piercing shriek. I didn't wait to see if it would recover. I ran, bursting out into the storm, the snow blinding me as I stumbled through the drifts. The wind howled, and the trees seemed to close in around me, their branches clawing at my skin. Behind me, I could hear the creature's laughter, growing louder and louder. "You can't escape," it roared. "You're mine." I don't know how long I ran, or how I found the main road. By the time I stumbled into the path of a plow truck, my hands and feet were numb, and my vision was swimming. The driver slammed on the brakes and jumped out, shouting something I couldn't hear over the ringing in my ears. I collapsed into his arms, my body shaking uncontrollably. There's something out there," I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. He looked at me like I was crazy, but he drove me into town anyway, where I spent the night in a motel. I never went back to the cabin. It's been 3 years since that night, but I still hear the knocking sometimes, faint and distant, like a memory clawing its way back to life. And every Christmas Eve, I hear the singing. The Last Carol. I've never been one for the holiday season. Sure, the lights are pretty, and the music can be nice in small doses. But for me, Christmas always carried an air of forced cheerfulness. This year was different, though. It wasn't just my usual disinterest. It was the crushing weight of loneliness. My parents had moved to Florida, my sister was celebrating with her in-laws across the country, and my friends were too busy with their own families. So, when my coworker Angela asked if I could house-sit her place in the countryside over Christmas, I jumped at the chance. A little peace and quiet sounded perfect, and the thought of not having to pretend to be merry was a bonus. Angela's house was a cozy little cottage at the edge of the woods, surrounded by thick trees and a winding driveway. She left me a detailed list of instructions. Feed her cat, water the plants, and keep an eye on the old furnace that tended to act up. "I know it's a little isolated," Angela had said, "but it's so peaceful this time of year. You'll love it." I arrived late on Christmas Eve, just as the sun was setting. The snow had started falling lightly, and the orange glow of the cottage lights felt warm and inviting against the growing chill. Inside, the house smelled like pine and cinnamon. Angela had left the tree decorated, its twinkling lights casting a soft glow across the room. A Christmas playlist played faintly from a speaker on the mantel. Should have been cozy, but something felt off. The first few hours were uneventful. I fed the cat, a grumpy gray tabby named Oliver, and made myself a cup of cocoa. I'd brought a stack of books to keep me company, but as the night wore on, I found it hard to focus. Every now and then, I'd hear creaks and groans from the house. Normal sounds for an old building in the cold, I told myself, but there were other noises too. Soft tapping at the windows, the faint crunch of snow outside. First, I thought it might be animals, deer maybe, or raccoons, but when I got up to check, there was nothing, just the empty expanse of white outside, undisturbed. I locked the doors, telling myself it was just my imagination. After all, I was alone in an unfamiliar house, miles away from anyone. A little unease was natural, but the noises didn't stop. Around midnight, the power went out. I was in the living room, curled up with a blanket, when the lights flickered once, twice, and then died completely. The music cut off mid-chorus, leaving the house in eerie silence. "Great," I muttered, grabbing my phone for light. Angela had warned me about this too. She'd said the power lines out here were unreliable, especially in bad weather. I found the flashlight she'd left me and lit a few candles for good measure. The glow of the fire in the hearth helped, but the shadows in the room seemed to stretch and shift, moving in ways that didn't quite make sense. Oliver hissed suddenly, his fur standing on end. He was staring at the front door, his green eyes wide and unblinking. "What's wrong, buddy?" I asked, my voice shaky. The cat backed away, growling low in his throat. And then I heard it. A knock. 3 loud, deliberate knocks on the front door. My heart leapt into my throat. Who would be out here at this hour in this weather? I crept to the door, flashlight in hand, and peered through the peephole. No one. The snow on the porch was untouched, pristine. But the knocking came again, louder this time, rattling the door on its hinges. "Hello," I called, my voice trembling. No answer. I turned the deadbolt, just to be safe, and stepped back. My phone buzzed in my pocket, startling me. I pulled it out and saw an alert. No signal. The knocking stopped, but the uneasy silence that followed was worse. I tried to tell myself it was just some prank. Kids messing around, or maybe even the wind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I didn't believe it. Oliver hadn't moved from his spot near the door. He stared at it like he could see something I couldn't. I decided to go to bed. Maybe if I ignored it, it would stop. The bedroom was small but comfortable, with a thick quilt and a view of the woods. I locked the door and left the flashlight on the nightstand. Sleep didn't come easily. Every creak and groan of the house made me jump, and the storm outside seemed to be growing worse. I was just starting to drift off when I heard it again. Knock, knock, knock. This time, it was coming from the bedroom window. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Slowly, I turned my head toward the window. The curtains were drawn, but I could see the faint outline of a figure standing just on the other side of the glass. I didn't move. My mind raced with possibilities. Could it be Angela? Someone who needed help? But no, that didn't make sense. "Who's there?" I whispered, barely audible. The figure didn't answer. It didn't move. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I grabbed the flashlight and threw open the curtains. Nothing. The snow outside was untouched, just like before. But the sense of being watched was stronger than ever. I didn't sleep after that. The rest of the night was a blur of paranoia and fear. I stayed in the living room, the fire burning low, and watched the shadows creep across the walls. The knocking came and went, moving from door to window and back again. Sometimes it sounded like whispers, faint and unintelligible, just beyond the edge of hearing. By the time dawn broke, I was a wreck. The storm had cleared, and the morning light cast the house in a soft, golden glow. For a moment, I almost convinced myself it was over, that I'd imagined the whole thing. But then I saw the footprints. They circled the house, starting at the front door and leading to each window in turn. And they weren't human. The prints were large, clawed, and impossibly deep, as if whatever had made them was heavier than any creature I knew. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I left the house that morning, abandoning my things in my rush to get out. Angela never mentioned anything strange when I called her later to explain why I'd left, but I could hear the unease in her voice. Whatever had visited me that Christmas Eve, it wasn't human, and it wasn't friendly. Now, every year when the snow falls and the carols start playing, I think about that night, about the knocking, the footprints, and the whispers in the dark, and I pray it never finds me again.